Chilling tales from the Appalachian Trail, a tourist lost for a year. The call came on a Tuesday. For Ben Carter, head of the Regional Search and Rescue Unit, it was a familiar routine. A hiker overdue, a worried family, a last known location. This one, however, would be different. He didn't know it then, standing over a topographical map with a fresh cup of coffee, that this one case would consume the next year of his life. He didn't know he'd be in this same spot. 1 year later, the map worn and frayed, his face etched with a fatigue that went bone deep, still asking the same exact question: where is Alex Miller? The Appalachian Trail is a place of breathtaking beauty, but for some, it becomes their final resting place. It's a ribbon of wilderness stretching nearly 2,200 miles from the mountains of Georgia to the rugged peaks of Maine, a path of pilgrimage for over 3 million people every year. They come looking for adventure, for solitude, for a connection to something ancient and untamed. And they find it. But the trail isn't different. It has its own rhythms, its own secrets, and sometimes it doesn't give people back. This is the story of what happens when that wilderness decides to keep a secret. It's the story of a tourist named Alex Miller, who stepped onto the trail with a heart full of hope and a sketchbook of empty pages, only to be swallowed by the green expanse. This is also the story of the search and rescue team that refused to let the wilderness win. A team that stared into the face of futility for 365 days, battling unforgiving terrain, the wrath of a historic storm, and their own dwindling hope in a search that became an obsession. This is the story of what happens when the trail turns on you, and the staggering cost of bringing someone home. Section 1. The Dreamer and the Trail. Alex Miller was, by all accounts, a man who lived more in his head than in the world. A 28-year-old graphic artist from Chicago, he was quiet, gentle, and almost always sketching in the dog-eared notebooks he carried everywhere. His friends called him an old soul, someone who just felt out of sync with the relentless pace of city life. He dreamed of vast, quiet places, of mountains and forests that had stood long before any concrete was ever poured. The Appalachian Trail wasn't just a hike for him. It felt like a necessary escape, a pilgrimage to find a piece of himself he felt he'd lost, or maybe never even had. He'd spent a year planning, or what he called planning anyway. He bought the gear, he read the blogs, and he traced the long, winding path on a map pinned to his apartment wall. As you can imagine, his parents were nervous. His father, a retired accountant, tried to talk him into a beach vacation. His mother packed him enough dehydrated meals to feed a small army. But Alex was resolute. He talked about the green tunnel, a thru-hiker term for the dense, leafy canopy that covers much of the trail in summer. He wanted to be enveloped by it. He wanted to fill his sketchbook with the textures of bark, the patterns of sunlight through leaves, the faces of the hardy thru-hikers he'd meet. He started his northbound journey at Springer Mountain, Georgia, in early April, right at the start of thru-hiker season. The first few weeks were a revelation. His early sketches, which his family would later pore over like sacred texts, were vibrant and full of life. There were detailed drawings of blooming trillium, of a gnarled oak tree that looked like an old man, of a misty sunrise over a rolling valley. His journal entries were just filled with a breathless sense of discovery. He wrote about the profound quiet of the woods at night, the simple joy of a hot meal after a long day's walk, the easy camaraderie he found with other hikers. He was happy. He checked in with his family every week or so, whenever he passed through a trail town with a post office or a flicker of cell service. His calls were cheerful, his voice full of a confidence they hadn't heard before. He wasn't Alex the quiet artist anymore. He was Sketch, his trail name, a member of the tribe. He was about 700 miles in, deep in the mountains of Virginia, when he made his last call home. It was late August. He told his sister he was about to enter Shenandoah National Park, a section he was particularly excited about. He promised he'd send a postcard from the next town. That postcard never arrived. A week passed, then 10 days. His family's texts went unanswered. Their calls went straight to voicemail. At first, they told themselves he was fine. The lack of cell service on the trail is notorious. He was probably just deep in the backcountry, enjoying the solitude he'd craved so much. But as the second week bled into a third, a cold dread began to settle in. They contacted the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. They contacted the National Park Service. And on the 24th day after Alex Miller's last call home, he was officially declared a missing person. Ben Carter got the call. As leader of the Virginia-based SAR team, he'd overseen dozens of these operations. Most end within 48 hours. A hiker takes a wrong turn, gets delayed by weather, or just misjudges their timing. They find them, tired and a little embarrassed, but safe. Ben expected this to be no different. He and his team set up a command post near the trail entrance where Alex was thought to have started his Shenandoah leg. The initial search was textbook. They had his last known location and his intended route. They sent ground teams to hike the trail in both directions. They searched shelters, campsites, and water sources. A helicopter was brought in to scan the canopy and ridges, its rhythmic thumping a familiar sound in these mountains. K-9 units were sent into the dense underbrush that flanked the main path. But the first few days yielded nothing. Not a footprint, not a dropped wrapper, not a single sign that Alex Miller had ever been there. It was as if the trail had just erased him. Ben started expanding the search grid. The terrain in the Shenandoahs can be deceptively rugged. While the trail itself is well maintained, stepping just a few hundred feet off the path can land you in a labyrinth of steep ravines and tangled rhododendron thickets. It was entirely possible Alex had wandered off trail, maybe to find a private spot to camp or to relieve himself, something that tragically happened in other cases, like that of Geraldine Largay. Ben's team was a mix of paid professionals and highly trained volunteers, people who gave up their weekends to brave the wilderness for strangers. But after a week of fruitless searching, morale began to dip. The physical toll was immense, but the mental toll was worse. Every empty ravine, every trail that led nowhere, chipped away at their optimism. They were searching for a ghost. As the second week began, a new threat appeared on the horizon, a swirling vortex of wind and rain churning in the Atlantic. Meteorologists were forecasting a monster storm to make landfall and track northwest, directly into the Appalachian Mountains. Ben knew what that meant. If Alex was out there, injured and exposed, his time was running out. If the storm hit, the search would be over. The window to find him alive was closing with terrifying speed. The team worked with a frantic urgency, pushing deeper into the backcountry, their calls of Alex, growing hoarser, more desperate. The only reply was the rising wind, whistling a mournful song through the trees. Section 2. The Storm and the Silence. The hurricane, by the time it reached the Blue Ridge Mountains, stalled over the spine of the Appalachians, unleashing a deluge of biblical proportions. For 3 straight days, rain fell in sheets, turning gentle streams into raging torrents and solid ground into treacherous mud. Violent winds howled through the gaps and over the ridges with a sustained, deafening roar. For Ben Carter and his team, it was a forced, agonizing retreat. The conditions were just too dangerous. Continuing the search would have been a suicide mission. They abandoned their command post and retreated to wait out the storm, every member feeling a profound sense of failure. They knew what this rain meant. It was washing away any potential tracks, any scent trail the dogs might have followed. The landscape they had been searching was being violently rewritten. When the storm finally passed, the devastation was staggering. The sheer force of the wind and water had inflicted catastrophic damage. Entire sections of the beloved trail had vanished, simply erased by mudslides. The green tunnel that Alex had been so excited to see was replaced by a chaotic jumble of fallen trees, a wall of splintered wood that made passage impossible. The trail that had been a clear path just days before was now a dangerous, unrecognizable maze. An able-bodied hiker trying to navigate it would have been hopelessly lost. A hiker trapped in it would have been entombed. The official search for Alex Miller was suspended indefinitely. Resources had to be diverted to community rescue and recovery efforts. For Alex's family, the news was an incomprehensible nightmare. Their son wasn't just missing anymore. He was missing in a disaster zone. Ben Carter officially closed the case file, but he couldn't close it in his mind. The face of the smiling young man from the missing person poster haunted him. So personnel have to learn to compartmentalize, but sometimes a case gets through. Alex Miller got through. Months passed. Autumn's colors painted over the scars on the landscape, and then winter draped the mountains in snow and ice. The search was a cold case, but for Ben, it was a persistent, low-grade fever. He spent his evenings poring over the maps again, rereading the files, looking for the one tiny detail they might have missed. He talked to his team, a small group of veterans who felt the same lingering unease. They spoke of compassion fatigue, the cynicism that can set in after repeated trauma and loss. They were rescuers, but they hadn't been able to rescue Alex. The feeling was a constant, dull ache. As spring brought a tentative green back to the ravaged forest, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and volunteers began the monumental task of rebuilding. Trail crews worked to punch through the worst of the blowdowns, clearing a narrow path through the chaos. It was during this time that Ben Carter decided he couldn't let it go. This was no longer an official search. The funding was gone, the multi-agency support a memory. This was personal. He gathered a small, core group from his old team. 3 volunteers who were just as haunted as he was. They would use their weekends to go back out. It wasn't a rescue mission anymore. Everyone knew that. It was a recovery. They were searching for a body, to give a family some measure of closure. They focused on areas that had been inaccessible right after the storm. Remote ravines, steep hillsides far from the trail, places where a person might have sought shelter or been swept away. It was grueling, thankless work. The landscape was still a wreck. Climbing over and under massive, unstable log jams was perilous. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The new summer growth was explosive, covering the forest floor in a dense carpet of green that could hide anything. Hope, which had been a flickering ember, was threatening to go out completely. Ben was on the verge of calling it off for good. They had given it everything. Maybe the wilderness had won. The dedication of search and rescue volunteers is almost superhuman. They're ordinary people who step into extraordinary circumstances, often at great personal cost, battling not just the elements, but the heavy psychological toll of their work. We get to tell these important stories of resilience, tragedy, and the unbreakable human spirit because of the support from viewers like you. If you're finding this story compelling, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It's a small click, but it allows us to continue doing what we do. Your support truly makes a difference. Section 3. The Sketchbook and the Echoes. It was a Sunday in late September, almost exactly 1 year since Alex Miller vanished. The air was crisp with the first hint of autumn, a painful reminder of the season when the search began. Ben Carter had decided this would be their last day. It was an unspoken agreement. They had to accept that they had failed. Ben was studying his worn map, a grid of lines he now knew better than his own neighborhood. There was one area, a small, brutally steep drainage basin miles west of the trail, that had nagged at him from the beginning. It was a place no hiker would ever go on purpose. But on the day Alex disappeared, a small, intense thunderstorm had rolled through, hours before the main hurricane warning. Ben's hunch was that Alex might have been caught on a ridge, panicked, and descended into the nearest thick cover to escape lightning. In the rain and confusion, he would have headed straight into this topographical nightmare. It was a long shot, a desperate, final guess. The team agreed to give it one last push. They spent hours fighting their way through the dense undergrowth and the last of the storm's debris. By mid-afternoon, they had found nothing. A heavy silence fell over the group. It was time to go home. As they prepared to turn back, one of the volunteers, Sarah, was picking her way across a field of mossy boulders near the bottom of the ravine. She slipped, her hand reaching out to steady herself against a large rock. Her fingers brushed against something that wasn't stone. It was smooth, synthetic fabric, wedged tightly in a crevice between 2 massive boulders. She pulled at it. It was stuck fast. She called Ben over. Together, they used a pry bar from Ben's pack to carefully widen the gap. They pulled out a small, waterproof stuff sack. It was covered in a year's worth of grime, but it was intact. Ben's heart was pounding. He slowly opened the drawstring. Inside, wrapped in a plastic bag, was a sketchbook. They sat there on the cold rocks in that forgotten ravine, as Ben carefully turned the fragile pages. The book was Alex Miller's final testament. It was the story of his last days, told not in words, but in pictures and frantic, scrawled notes. The first 2/3 of the book contained the beautiful drawings his family knew. But then, the style changed abruptly. The confident lines gave way to hurried, chaotic scratches. A drawing of a fork in the trail with a question mark scribbled above it. A sketch of a dark, menacing sky, the page smudged with what looked like raindrops. A few pages later, a drawing of a leg, grotesquely swollen, with the words "bad fall." Can't put weight on it. The drawings became more terrifying. Images of disorientation, swirling trees, a compass spinning wildly. The wilderness was no longer a place of beauty, it was a prison. He was documenting his own descent into despair. He'd gotten turned around in that first thunderstorm Ben theorized about. He'd fallen and broken his ankle. He tried to follow the creek bed, a common and often fatal mistake, believing it would lead him out. Instead, it led him deeper into the labyrinth. Then came the drawings of the hurricane. The pages were filled with dark, violent slashes of pencil, depicting lashing rain and falling trees. A sketch showed a crude shelter he'd built being ripped apart by the wind. He was trapped and injured in the middle of a historic storm. The final entries were heartbreaking. The drawings stopped. There were only words, the handwriting growing weaker. He wrote about the silence after the storm, a silence that was somehow louder and more terrifying than the wind had been. He wrote about his dwindling food, the pain, the crushing loneliness. He wrote messages to his parents and his sister. He told them he loved them. He told them not to be sad. He wrote that he had seen so much beauty. The last entry was dated 13 days after he had gotten lost. It was just 3 words. "It's so cold." The sketchbook was a map. The drawings of the rock formations, the specific bend in the creek. Alex, the artist, had given them the clues. Following the visual diary, the team moved a quarter-mile further down the ravine. And there, tucked into a small overhang at the base of a cliff face, they found him. His sleeping bag, his pack, his earthly remains. He had been there all along, less than 3 miles from the trail, but in a place so ravaged by the storm that he had remained hidden for a full year. Ben Carter made the call he had been dreading and hoping to make for 12 long months. There was no relief in his voice, only a profound, bottomless sadness. He had found Alex Miller. He was bringing him home. The discovery of Alex Miller brought an end to the search, but not an end to the pain. For his family, it was the confirmation of their worst fears, a brutal finality that offered closure but no comfort. For Ben Carter and his team, it was a hollow victory. They had succeeded, but the weight of that year, the cost of that discovery, would stay with them forever. And while the story of Alex Miller and Ben Carter is a work of fiction, created to honor the very real challenges faced on the trail, the dangers it highlights are not. Hikers do get lost, often just steps from safety. The wilderness is powerful and unforgiving, and sudden storms can and do cause catastrophic damage. Every day, real volunteers like the fictional Ben Carter put their own lives on hold, and often at risk, to answer the call of a stranger in need. The Appalachian Trail remains a place of wonder, a national treasure that calls to the adventurer in all of us. But it demands respect. If you answer its call, be prepared. Carry a map and compass and know how to use them. Don't just rely on a phone in a place with little to no service. A personal locator beacon can be a lifeline. Tell people your exact plans and stick to them. Pack for the worst-case scenario, because in the mountains, the worst-case scenario is always a possibility. Alex Miller went into the woods seeking beauty, and he found it. But he also found its unforgiving heart. His story is a chilling reminder of the fine line between adventure and tragedy. It's a tribute to a life lost, and to the quiet heroes who refuse to let the wilderness have the final word, who walk into the deepest shadows to bring the lost back into the light.